Today's shiur begins halfway down Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. If you prefer, you can count 25 lines from the top. You'll notice a slash mark, and following that, Sholach Rabbi Chia bar Ovin. Before we begin the actual Gemara, we glance at the side, under the nose, say the topic heading. Eich mechashvim. How do we calculate? Shloisha chadoshim shel hamtona ben gever legever. The required 3-month waiting period between husband number 1 and husband number 2. A woman who leaves husband number 1 either through divorce or through becoming a widow, and she wants to marry a second husband. So we have spoken extensively about this in our recent shiurim, about the need of waiting 3 months in order to establish is she or is she not pregnant from the first husband. Another issue of time calculation involves Chof Dalid Chodesh, the 24-month waiting period. Tzricha meinekes lahamtin lifnei nisua l'sheni. A woman who is nursing a child, she must wait 24 months before she can marry a second husband. The fear being that if she becomes pregnant during the nursing period, pregnant with a second child, the milk supply for the child currently nursing will dry up. So the Gemara, Sholach Rabbi Chia bar Ovin, Me'arsin toich shloisha. Erusin can take place within 3 months. In other words, after husband 1 dies, she can marry through namely become arusa. In halacha, we speak about 2 stages involved in marriage. The first stage is where the woman receives money or another form of erusin, which makes her an eishes ish, and they consummate the marriage sometime later through nisuin. But before that, we're speaking right now about the erusin stage, so that she can do within 3 months of her departure from the first husband. V'chein oisin maisa means, and thusly I saw it done, practiced by the rabbis. V'chein hoya Rebbe Ozer melamdenu mishum Rabbi Chanino hagadol, and thusly Rebbe Ozer taught in the name of the great Rabbi Chanino. Ruboi shel rishoin v'rubo shel shlishi v'emtsoi sholem. All that one has to wait is the majority of the first month, the majority of the last month, and the entire middle month, indicating the representation of 3 months, even though it's not a full 3 months. Ameimar shora liores biyom tishim. Ameimar allowed a woman who had been divorced or widowed to enter erusin on day 90, indicating 3 full months. Omarle Ravashi Lameimar. Ravashi asks Ameimar v'ho Rav Shmuel the Amri Travayu. Is it not so that Rav and Shmuel both said Tzrichel Hamtin Gimel Chadoshim Chutz Miyom Shemeis Bo v'Chutz Miyom Shenisarsa Bo? The calculation of the 3 full months, according to Rav and Shmuel, is exclusive of the day of death of the first husband and exclusive of the day of betrothal at the end of the 3 months. So it would be, let us say, 92 days are required. So that's the question that Ravashi posed to Ameimar. Ameimar answers, Hahu, this idea of a full period exclusive of a beginning day and an end day, that is true and has ramifications regarding another area of halacha. Hahu l'inyan meinekes itmar. That was stated with regard to the nursing woman. The Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Travayu, both Rav and Shmuel say, Tzrichel lahamtin chof dalid chodesh. The nursing woman must wait 24 months, chutz miyom shenolad bo, besides the day of birth, v'chutz miyom shenisarsa bo, and besides the day of the erusin. So the idea of chutz miyom, with the exception of the day of the beginning and the day of the end, that has application to the issue of the 24-month waiting period involving the nursing woman, but not with regard to the 3-month waiting period for erusin, with the second husband. Question, V'ho, and we should point out, by the way, that the diamond is featured under the Mivneh heading on the side. Shnei Kushos, 2 questions. Al-ho demar meimar demar arsin biyom atishim. So we have a second question now regarding Ameimar's comment that Erusin takes place on day 90. So the Gemara asks, V'ho hahu de'ovat seudas Erusin biyom tishim. There was an event where someone made a feast, a meal, in celebration of the Erusin on day 90, V'afsidei Rava l'sudase, and Rava threw out the meal. He destroyed the meal. In other words, what are you doing making a meal on day 90? It's too early. So the Gemara answers, Ahi, that involves something else. Ahi sudas nisuin havoi. That wasn't a sudas Erusin. Erusin can be done on day 90, says Ameimar. The story that you cited involved someone making a feast concerning nisuin, and in that case it would have been premature. V'hilchasa, and the Gemara rules, Tzricho lahamtin chavdalet chodesh chutz miyom shenolad bo v'chutz miyom shenisarsa bo. Regarding the meinekes, 24 full months must be observed in terms of gap, a full 24-month gap between marriages. Chutz miyom shenolad bo, besides the day of the child's birth. Chutz miyom shenisarsa bo, and besides the day of Erusin. So if the woman has been nursing the child for 24 full months, besides the beginning day and end day just mentioned, then she can marry a second man. And regarding the 3-month waiting period, the Gemara rules that the 3 months are a full 3 months besides the day of first husband's death and besides the day of the betrothal with the second husband. The Gemara continues with a quote from the Mishnah. Before we look into the Gemara text, let's glance at the side where we see a nosei, mivneh, a topic heading and structural note featured. And we also indicate that this discussion goes ad sof omid beis. It's a long discussion, and it takes us till the end of Mem Gimel Omid Beis. First we have a bow tie shape featured. These bow ties represent shlavim, they're stages. V'nisayon, attempting levarer shitas Rav Yossi, b'mishnah Mem Aleph Omid Aleph, attempting to clarify, explain Rav Yossi's opinion that was cited in the Mishnah back on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. The Omar, he said, Kol hanoshim yisarsu chutz mino almono mipnei ho'ibol, that all women are entitled to enter Erusin immediately after the previous husband, with the exception of the widow because of mourning considerations. That's what he said. That's a quote. What is involved? What does that mean? That we have to see. In addition, we're going to be using a house shape as a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track. When you see the house mark with the point facing up, Tomea al Rav Yossi mikoach kavachomer. The Gemara will be raising a question on Rav Yossi's opinion through kal v'chomer logic. In other words, as a result of doing analyzing the matter through kal v'chomer, we're going to end up with a question on Rav Yossi's approach. The inverted house represents responses, dechios utshuvos. They are rejections of whatever is claimed or answers, responses. So that in effect the house mark facing up represents a challenge to Rav Yossi, and the inverted house should represent a defense. And as we said, this discussion continues in terms of the discussion trying to clarify what Rav Yossi means until the end of Omid Beis. And now the Gemara. The quote from the Mishnah, Rav Yossi Omer, Kol hanoshim yisarsu chutz min almona mipnei ha'ibol. Omar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda raises a question. He is tomeha, he is befuddled regarding that which Rav Yossi answers the almona le'oreis, all for 30 days. In other words, other women can enter erusin after leaving their first husband immediately. But in the almona, the widow, she has to wait 30 days. So Rav Chisda asks, and notice this is a long question. Omar Rav Chisda, Kal v'chomer. Through Kal v'chomer, we should be able to conclude to the contrary. The week in which Tisha B'Av falls out, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the day in which we mourn the destruction of the first and second Beis Hamikdash, the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out, the halacha says one cannot wash clothing, but one is allowed to lay oreis, because erusin is not considered a source of joy, and it is a mitzvah, as Rashi says. So that is a description of the what's called Shabbos Shechal Tishav Yos B'Secha. So that's a situation where it's Ozer L'Chabes Mutaloris. Mokom Shemuter L'Chabes, within 30 days of Avelus, Kibbutz is also Kibbutz. The washing of clothing is also only for the initial 7 days. But within the 30 days, one is allowed to wash clothing. So Eino Din Shemuter L'Oreis. All the more so, we will allow erusin. So in a situation where we see severity, there's an Isser Kibbutz, but yet we allow erusin. In a situation where there's leniency regarding Kibbutz, certainly we can be lenient regarding erusin. Maihi, what is the background? Tisnan. So here we see the background information for what Rav Chisda is drawing on. It says Tisnan in the following Tanaic source: Shabbos Shechal Tisha B'Secha, the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out. Also l'saper l'chabes, it's forbidden to take haircuts and to wash clothing. Ubachamishi, on Thursday of that week, muter l'pnei kavod haShabbos, as a sign of honor of Shabbos. In order to enter Shabbos properly bathed and looking nice, so we allow the haircut and the washing of clothing. V'tanya koidem hazman hazeh ha'am mimatim be'iskehem. Now, before Tisha B'Av. Now, right now, this word kodem, we're thinking it means, and this is subject to change later on, but kodem hazman hazeh, we're thinking that it means before Tisha B'Av, during that week in which Tisha B'Av comes out. So the source tells us, ha'am mimatim be'iskehem, midusam litain. The people reduce the amount of business dealings they have. Milivnos from the torah, from also reduce involvement with building and planting. Uma'ar sin, but erusin can take place. Avolo kainsin v'ein oisin sudas erusin. Lo kainsin means we don't consummate marriages. That's nisuin. Nor do we make feasts for the event of the erusin, the betrothal. So what do we see from this source? We see that you have a period of time where washing of clothing is forbidden, but erusin is mutter. With that in mind, so Rav Chisda is able to develop his kal v'chomer, resulting in allowing erusin even within 30 days. So why does Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah say that erusin, in the case of an almona, must hold off? You must hold off on her erusin for a full 30 days. When you see through the kal v'chomer, that should not be the case. The Gemara answers, Ki tanyo hahi, koidem de koidem. Regarding the source in which, the line just above where it says ma'arsin, it's not during the week of in which Tisha B'Av falls out, but it's before the week. It's kodem, before. Not just before Tisha B'Av, but we're talking about a time before the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out. So it's during that time that we say that it's muter l'chabes, and therefore we don't have the kal v'chomer. In other words, because that is a week in which it's muter l'chabes, just to remind ourselves, the Kal V'chomer that Rav Chisda developed was based on a time period that it's Ozer L'chabes and yet Muter Le'ores. So from that he was able to develop the Kal V'chomer. But if you're talking about Kodim de Kodim, so then you don't have an illustration of something that it's Ozer L'chabes. Omar Rava the Kodim Ami Kal V'chomer. But even so, says Rava, we still have a Kal V'chomer that should weaken Rabbi Yossi's position. So now we're talking about not the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out, but prior to that. Uma b'mokoim she'asur lisa v'litein muter le'ores. This is what we're saying now, is Kodem is not like we thought meant the days before Tisha B'Av, but rather the time prior to the week of Tisha B'Av, where it's Ozer to engage in business, and yet it's muter to enter Erusin. Mokoim shemuter lisa v'litein, where within 30 days of Avelus, a person is allowed to engage in business. Einudin shemuter le'ores. Certainly, he should be allowed to enter Erusin. So once again, you have a Kal V'chomer, the result of which, that within 30 days of the death of her husband, she should be allowed to enter Erusin. The Gemara responds, Lo tema de Rabbi Yossi Omer kol hanoshim yisarsu. Rabbi Yossi wasn't talking about women entering Erusin to begin with, and then having the widow being an exception. Elo ema, rather, what did Rabbi Yossi say? Kol hanoshim yinasu. All women can enter nisuin immediately. And then, with the exception of the woman who became an avela because her husband died. The Gemara asks, and we continue at the top of Amud Beis. Could that really be that's what Rabbi Yossi says, that all women, after leaving their first husbands, can enter nisuin, can consummate marriages with their second husband? The Rabbi Yossi lahabchin, does Rabbi Yossi not concern himself with the issue of distinguishing between first husband and second husband regarding the offspring? If we allow a woman, after having been with a first husband, to enter and consummate a marriage with a second husband immediately, no, she might be pregnant. And we're not, according to this, we're not waiting any time, and you will not know who the father is. The Gemara answers, Leslie. One approach is to simply say, no, he doesn't concern himself with that. Another approach is Li'olam Islay. V'ema, notice this is a third restatement of Rabbi Yossi, a third presentation of Rabbi Yossi. And that's why this is called number 3. And say thusly, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kol Arusos Grushos Yinasu. All women that had been arusas only, they left their first husband without ever having consummated the marriage with the first husband. So there's no chashash of pregnancy. Grushos, they were divorced. So they had reached only a state of erusin and were divorced. Yinasu, they are allowed to enter nisuin immediately. There's no fear of a woman having been impregnated from the first husband. So we can allow her to consummate the marriage with the second husband. However, an arusa almona, not an arusa grusha, but a woman that had been in erusin, and her husband died, she cannot enter nisuin immediately because she has to wait 30 days as a result of avelus, mourning over the first husband. So that's what Rabbi Yossi is supposedly saying. The Gemara asks, Ihachi, if that's Shitas Rabbi Yossi, Hainu Rabbi Yehuda. Well, that's then the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda. and they appear in the same Mishnah, they obviously can't be saying the same thing. Rav Yehuda also allows an arusa to enter nisuin. There's a Rashi, a few lines down from here. We're looking at the Rashi. V'afilu hachi yinasu kotani. Actually, let's go to the next Rashi instead. Let's continue further down. Hachi hainu Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda nami shari arusa linase. Rav Yehuda also allows the arusa. She left her first husband from a state of erusin to enter nisuin, to consummate a marriage with the second husband immediately. And we can't say that Rav Yossi is coming to tell us a novel point that is concerning the mourning. The Nisuin Ozer called Shloshim, that consummating marriage with a second person would be forbidden for a total of 30 days because of the mourning. Everyone agrees with that Nisuin is a source of joy. V'inasu dekoma Rav Yehuda agrusha. Therefore, when Rav Yehuda says Yinasu, that women that were arusas can marry immediately, he had to have been referring to the grusha, the leko ibul ko'amar, where there is no issue of mourning. So what is the difference between Rav Yossi and Rav Yehuda? If you present Rav Yossi as saying, like we just did there, Rav Yossi says, kol arusas grushas yinasu. The Gemara answers, Ika binayu, nisua le'ores. A point of difference between them would be another case. A case where a woman had been nisua to the first husband, she'd consummated her marriage with the first husband, and now she's left the first husband. Can she enter erusin with the second husband? Once again, let's to remind you that when you enter erusin, you're not creating a chashash, an element of doubt concerning a pregnancy, because erusin is the stage before the consummation of the marriage. Rav Yehuda Savar, Nisua Muteres Liores, a woman that had left her first husband from a state of Nisuin, she can enter erusin immediately. And Rav Yossi Savar Nisua Asura Liores. Rav Yossi would take the stricter opinion, holding that a Nisua cannot enter erusin immediately, because we make a gzeira, a prohibition, we impose a prohibition of erusin in anticipation of nisuin. Namely, if we would allow erusin, Rav Yossi is afraid we'll allow nisuin, and then you get into the problem of havchona, the distinguishing between children, from first father, from first husband, or from second husband. The Gemara asks, the Sover of Yossi Nesua Asura Li'ores. Could that be that Rav Yossi in fact holds thusly according to that restriction? V'ha Tanya. You'll notice the triangles that appear here, they highlight questions. One is here, and a few lines afterwards another triangle. So the Gemara asks, V'ha Tanya Rav Yossi Omer Kol Hanoshim Yisarsu. All women are entitled to enter erusin with the second husband, chutz min ha'almana b'pnei ha'evil, with the exception of a woman whose departure from the first husband was through his death, because she has to observe a period of mourning. V'kamo evil shalah, how long is the mourning period? Shloshim yom, 30 days. V'chulan lo yinasu ad shiu lohen shlosha chadashim. All nisuos, and that point is brought out by Rashi. All nisuos should not enter a state of nisuah with the second husband until 3 months lapse. With regard to a nisuah, someone who was nisuah with the first husband, so the 3-month waiting period is necessary for the purpose of distinguishing between the fathers. Who is the father? But what do we see here? we see from this source, Rabbi Yossi seems to allow Erusin immediately. So to present Rabbi Yossi as differing from Rabbi Yehuda on the grounds of immediate Erusin, that doesn't seem to be true. The Gemara responds, Hi, my Kushya. What is the difficulty in this source that supposedly poses a question to the way we answered the issue of what's the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi before? If it's because it says in this source, Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol Hanoshim Yisarsu, that all women can enter Erusin, including the Nesuos, which shows that Rabbi Yossi doesn't restrict the Nesua from entering Erusin with the second husband. Is that what is bothering you? Well, mi alimo limas nisin. Is this brisa any stronger than the Mishnah? De ukimna, we explained that expression of kol anoshim yisarsu be'arusos grushos yinasu. In the Mishnah we explained that it's a reference to not literally all women, but women who had been in a state of erusin and were divorced. Those kind of women can enter Nisuin immediately. And that's how we explained this phrase in the Mishnah. Hachanami, so too here, Kol Arusos Grushos Yinasu. So that when Rabbi Yossi says Kol Hanoshim Yisarsu, it's really a more specific category. All women who were Arusos and divorced, they can enter Nisuin immediately. So on, and with that in mind, then you can see that Rabbi Yossi will disagree with Rabbi Yehuda on the issue of a Nesua and her ability to enter Erusin immediately. So that Rabbi Yossi's heter only covers Arusos Grushos, not Nesuos. Elo Misefa. However, if we're going to raise a problem for what we said earlier, that will come from the latter part of the source. Dekotani, it said, V'chulon lo yinosu ad shiu lohen gimel chadoshim. And we explained all Nesuos, including Grushos, shall not enter Nisuin until 3 months go by. And now we infer from this, in Subi hu delo, ha isrusi shapir dami. All that Rabbi Yossi prevents is their entering a state of Nisuin. But to enter a state of Erusin, that would be okay. So that from the source you see that a Nesua that is Grusha is allowed to enter Erusin immediately. So how can you say above in trying to distinguish between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi that Rabbi Yossi would say that a Nesua cannot enter Erusin immediately? Here we see that a Nesua could enter Erusin immediately. Omar Rava Tritz v'ema hachi. So restate things and state it thusly. Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol Arusos Grushos Yinasu. All women that had been only Arusa with their first husband and were divorced, they can enter Nisuin immediately, Chutz min hu almona, with the exception of an almona that was an Arusa, B'nei ha'ibol, because of the Avelus, the mourning considerations. We don't allow her to enter Nisuin immediately. The Kamo ibol shela, and how long must she observe Avelus? Shloshim yom, 30 days. Unesuos lo yisarsu ad shiehei lohen shloisha chadashim. Women that were Nesua with the first husband cannot enter Erusin with the second husband until 3 months go by. And this, you see, we have an arrow here. This is just like we had Rabbi Yossi above, where he said that a Nesua is asur li'orais. We mentioned at the time because of Xera of Erusin otu Nisuin. So as far as setting up Rabbi Yossi, under what circumstances does he allow immediate entrance to second marriage? Under what circumstances is immediate entrance not allowed? So we have it restated here, and with this we can also see the distinction between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara asks, and here we have a question that would draw our attention back to the issue of mourning. The almona, and I do note, by the way, that this is a long question. We should also point out that there's a double star that you see to the left-hand side of the Gemara, and above there's also a double star. It's highlighting the information that we wrote in between the lines there, and there we had noted Avo Arusos Almonois Lo Inasu Mitneo Ibel. A woman that had been in a state of Arusa, and the Orus died, and now it was an issue of entering marriage with a second husband, so she cannot do so immediately because of mourning. So regarding that, we ask, and note that this is a long question, the almona min ho'erusin mi isla ibul. Does a widow, a woman who becomes a widow because her husband died, but she had only been an arusa with the first husband, do the laws of mourning apply? The following Tanaic source. Now, there's a lot of information in this source, but we want to focus on the issue of mourning. And you'll also see the term onain or onenes. The word onain or onenes is associated with rules of mourning, without getting into any further detail. But let us now continue with the source itself. Ishto arusa, a man whose wife had reached only a state of erusin with him. If she dies, lo oinain v'lo metamelo, he doesn't observe the rules of mourning, nor does he defile himself to her if he happens to be a Kohen. V'chein hi lo oinenes v'lo metama loi. Likewise, if he dies, she was to him only an arusa. So lo onenes we dashed underline. That's the key thing here. There's no mourning. V'lo metamalo. There's no mitzvah for her to become tomei and involve herself with his burial. Mesa, if she dies, eino yorsha. She's an arusa, so that does not entitle the husband to inherit her. Meis hu, if he dies, leaving her the arusa widow, gova ksubasa. She will collect her ksuba, assuming that he wrote out for the ksuba. This is a financial guarantee or security that married women, upon their becoming widows, would receive. What's the point? To explain that Rabbi Yossi holds that the arusa would have to observe mourning is seemingly untenable. Elo tanoihi. Notice this is number 5. This is now another presentation of Shitas Rav Yossi. Before we learn the Gemara, let's glance at the Rashi, first line under the Gemara text. Hachi garsina elo tanoihi elo liolam kidekatoni masnisen. Rather, we're going back to the original Mishnah text. Kol hanoshim yisarsu. All women can enter erusin uchleparshina b'reish maitin. And as we explained at the beginning of this topic, the anesuos koi. That when we say all women can enter erusin, we're really referring to the women that had been nisuos. The ibol ika binayo. And the issue of mourning will be the point of difference between Rav Yossi and the other opinions. V'ashminin the erusin b'mei evel Ozer. And he is telling us that entering erusin during the mourning period is forbidden. Udekashilach And you'll ask, what do you mean entering Erusin during this time period is forbidden? Did we not learn the source before of Kodim Hazman, Dikotoni Ma'arsin? The end of Omen Aleph, we saw that Ma'arsin is allowed during we'll call the morning period of the Beis HaMikdash. Tanoihi, this issue is a machlokes Tanadiko Lamanda Osar. There is an opinion that nevertheless does restrict. And the source at the bottom of Amud Aleph that said Ma'arsin is allowed, Lav Divrei HaKolhi, it's not according to all opinions. And Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold by that. Rabbi Yossi is restrictive. And as far as the issue is concerned, of Ma'arsin, we said that this is a machlokes tanoim, and this source that we're about to read now will tie into the source that we saw at the bottom of Amud Aleph. The source at the bottom of Amud Aleph was lenient with regard to Erusin. Here we'll see to the contrary. Desanyo, Meirosh Chodesh V'ad Hatainis, from the beginning of the month of Av until Tisha B'Av, Ha'om Mematin Mi'iskein L'Sivilitein L'Ifnas V'Toa, the public reduces their preoccupation with business matters, with the purchases and sales, restrictions regarding building and planting. Notice we dashed under on the key word, and also an arrow that indicates to look back to Amud Aleph, where you saw to the contrary, that Erusin would be allowed. Shabbos Shechal Tisha B'Av Lios B'Seicha, the week in which Tisha B'Av falls out, also L'Sapu L'Chabes, it's also to take haircuts and to wash clothing. V'yesh Omrim Kol HaChodesh Ozer, and some say the entire month. Maskif law Rav Ashi. Mimai de le'ores mamash. Who is to say that the restriction of le'ores in this source is a reference to the simple act of erusin, where a man gives the woman money or a shtar or bia to create erusin? And if you were to say that, so then we can see that there is room for chumrah, for stringency regarding laws of mourning, even with regard to simple erusin. Well, who says that this is talking about simple erusin? Dilmo lemevat sudas erusin hu da'aser. Haliore shapir domi. Maybe all the source is restricting is the making of a feast celebrating the erusin, but simple erusin itself would be allowed, because erusin does not conflict with the laws of mourning. We have a bracketed section that we will skip immediately, initially that is, and with that in mind then, we still have lack of clarity as to what the position of Rav Yossi is, because on the one hand, he seems to say that for an almona to enter erusin would be restricted because of the avelus consideration. At this point, we don't see that. We're skipping the brackets. Elo Omar Rav Ashi, shiny avelus chadosha me avelus yishana. There's a distinction to be made between the avelus of a recent, a fresh personal nature versus the avelus, the mourning over the Beis HaMikdash. Namely, with regard to the mourning of the Beis HaMikdash, so that's what the source above was, that's what the source that seems to indicate leniency. In other words, basic erusin is allowed, but that's in the context of the Beis HaMikdash topic. The source above here that said that we restrict milaris is what we suggested. That's what Rav Ashi suggested, that means making a feast. All right, that we won't do during the time period ushering in Tisha B'Av. But simple erusin is allowed. Well, that's because that's avelus yeshana. What Rabbi Yossi was referring to before about the almona should not enter erusin immediately. That's Avelus Chadosha. V'shayni Avelus D'Rabba me Avelus D'Yochid. And likewise, there is a distinction to be made between Avelus that affects the public, like that of Tisha B'Av, versus the Avelus that affects the individual, like the issue of a woman becoming a widow. So with that distinction in mind, we won't challenge setting up Rabbi Yossi as we did earlier, that a woman who happened to be a Nesua does not enter Erusin immediately. And with that, then, we see the distinction between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah. Arba achin nesuin arba noshim umesu. 4 brothers were married to their wives respectively, and the men died. There are other brothers. Imrotzo, and they died, of course, we learn in Yevamos, so we assume they died without children. Imrotzo hagodol shebahem liyabeim es kulan horashus biado. If the eldest of the brothers wants to do yibum, he can be miyabeim each one of them. So he'll end up with 4 wives. Mishoya nosui lishtei noshim umeis bi'oso chalitzosa shel achas mehen poteres tzorasa. A man who had been married to 2 wives dies leaving no children, so only one of the wives needs to participate in the act of yibum, of marriage with a surviving brother, or chalitza. And that act will exempt or free the second wife to marry whomever she wants. Hoysa, we continue at the top of Mem Daled Omed Aleph. Hoysa achas kshera v'achas psula. The man who had been married to 2 wives, one of the women was kosher to the kahuna, and the other was unfit to the kahuna. Imagine a man married a woman who was a grusha. So it's a totally fine marriage. But a grusha, a divorcee, is someone that cannot marry a Kohen. So we have, we'll just say, Ruvain and Shimon. They're 2 brothers. Ruvain dies leaving 2 wives. One is a woman that had never been married before. Her first marriage was to Ruvain. Now she's a widow. A widow is a type of woman that can marry a Kohen. Other than a Kohen Gadol, Kohanim are allowed to marry widows. The other wife that Ruvain leaves now as a widow is a woman that had been married to a previous man and divorced from him. Shimon is confronted with these 2 women, and he has a choice. Should he do chalitza or should he do yibum? Im hoya choletz the psula. If he chooses the route of chalitza, of non-marriage, he should do the chalitza with the grusha, with the wife of Reuven that happened to be a divorcee. V'im hoya miyabeim lakshera. And if he chooses to marry, he should marry the woman that is kshera lakuhuna. You see, if he were to choose to do chalitza with the kshera, so he's now taking a woman that had the kahuna as an option for marriage, and now by becoming a chalutza, she becomes disqualified. So why disqualify a woman through chalitza when you could have done the chalitza with the other wife that was already disqualified anyway from the kahuna? The Gemara asks a technical question. Even when we read the Mishnah, we didn't note the problem, but the Mishnah opened up with 4 brothers. It said there were 4 brothers that were married to 4 women, and they died. It sounds like that's it. That's the end of the family. So if that's the end of the family, how can you discuss any other brothers that are doing yibum? They all died. Arba achin salkadaitach. 4 brothers, and that's it. And then you tell me they died. Who is available to do yibum? Elo'ema arba'a mei achin. The more accurate understanding of the Mishnah, and this is the way we explain the Mishnah, 4 of the brothers died. There were other brothers left, but 4 of them died, Those 4 not having left any children. The Mishnah pointed out that if the eldest brother should so desire, he can marry in Yibum all 4 widows. And that was, the Mishnah mentioned, Harashus Biyado. He has that option. The Gemara asks, Vishavki le, would we leave him be? Would we allow him to do that? To marry all 4? And how is he going to support all of them? V'atanya, there's a Tanaic source which deals with this matter, and it says, V'koru lo zikne iro, and the elders of the city will call him, will speak to the Yavam, the Hein v'lo shluchan, the elders themselves and not their agents, not their emissaries. V'dibro olav, and they will speak to him. Malamed, this teaches us, the fact that the Torah says v'dibro olav, they speak to him, what do you think they have to talk about? The weather? So Malamed, this teaches us, shemasiyin lo eitza hoyenes lo, they give him wise counsel. If the Yavam was very young and the widow is old, Huzake the Yalda, or he is old and she's quite young, Omrim lo, we tell him, Ma l'choitzel Yalda, Ma l'choitzel Zakena, why marry someone with such a big age discrepancy? That if he's old, what business do you have? Why would you want to marry someone so young? Or if he's young and she's old, why would you want to marry such an old woman? Go to someone like yourself and don't bring into your house strife and controversy. So what do we see? We see that in the context of a Yibum marriage, one is supposed to do so with a certain degree of common sense. So the question goes back, 4 women, how is he going to support all of them? Lo tzricha, the case of the Mishnah where we give him license to do so, de efshalei, where he's a man of means, and he's able to support and care for all of them. Well, if you're telling me that the Mishnah is describing a man of means, afilu tu vanami, so then why 4? You can have even more. More answers. There's an element of good counsel here too. Dalid in lo, 4 yes, but more than that no. Ki hechi de nimte oina b'chodesh. Ona is the expectation, the requirement of a man to provide conjugal relations, cohabitation with his wife. And Rashi points out that a Talmud Chacham is expected to provide this he's supposed to engage in Ona, let's say once a week, each Friday night. And if he has 4 wives, he'll be able to provide for them once each woman will receive his attention, the intimacy, once a month. Rashi says, Oina b'chodesh, Oina shel Talmud Chacham, the Oina, the time for a Talmud Chacham, for a Torah scholar. This, by the way, is, we're just touching on a much longer sugya and a Mishnah in Maseches Ksubos, which spells out different kinds of people based on their occupations. So a Talmud Chacham, Rashi points out, his Oina is Me'erev Shabbos Le'erev Shabbos. V'zeu asher piri yitem be'ito. Ksubos, demoti l'chol chada Oina b'chodesh. That way, the woman, when he has 4 wives, so each woman will receive his attention once a month. And that's considered acceptable, legitimate, and as we saw before that will obviate any strife and contention in the house. Before we conclude